The clock on the newsroom wall reads 6:47 a.m. A journalist sits under fluorescent light, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the thin blue glow of a monitor, hands moving over a keyboard with urgent, practiced speed. The headline taking shape on the screen reads, "Markets plunge as investors fear Fed tightening." He didn't witness the fear. He didn't measure the investors. He didn't observe a single act of plunging. What he did, in the space of 40 minutes, working from a list of closing numbers, was construct a story. A tidy, 4-word cause and effect explanation for an event that involved the simultaneous, independent decisions of millions of human beings, reacting to thousands of variables, most of which no single person alive fully understands. By 8 a.m., that headline will be read by 4 million people. By noon, financial analysts will cite it as context. By the following week, it will have quietly become part of the official narrative of what happened that Tuesday in October. This is not journalism failing. This is the human brain doing exactly what it evolved to do. We are, at our core, story-making machines. And that is both our greatest strength and one of our most dangerous cognitive vulnerabilities. Welcome to the case against narrative thinking. Not against storytelling itself, but against the specific, systematic, largely invisible way that our hunger for narrative distorts our perception of reality, corrupts our analysis of the past, and leads us to make catastrophically bad predictions about the future. The defendant is the narrative fallacy. The term was popularized by Nassim Taleb in his 2007 book, The Black Swan. Taleb described it as our tendency to construct coherent, causal stories around sequences of events, even when those events were produced by randomness, coincidence, or factors so complex they resist any single explanation. The human brain is not a passive recorder of reality. It is an aggressive meaning maker. It scans incoming data for patterns, links causes to effects, assigns intentions to outcomes, and packages the result as a smooth, confident story, whether or not the underlying facts support it. The result is a world that feels comprehensible, logical, navigable. The problem is, it isn't. The world is genuinely complex, genuinely random, genuinely resistant to the simple story structures our minds keep imposing on it. That gap between the world as it is and the story our brain tells us about the world is where most of the big mistakes happen. Let us begin with the domain where the narrative fallacy is most measurable and most expensive: financial markets. Economist Paul Tetlock published a landmark study in 2007, analyzing financial media coverage against actual market movements. The question was deceptively simple. Do the stories that explain market moves actually predict future moves? Tetlock found that media pessimism did have short-term predictive power. Negative sentiment could temporarily push prices down through noise trader behavior. But this was followed by reversion as prices corrected toward fundamentals. The stories influenced markets through sentiment contagion rather than genuine causal insight, and the net predictive value was negligible. Millions of people every day read confident explanations of why markets moved. Investors update mental models. Portfolio managers adjust strategies. Pension funds shift allocations, all based on stories that are, statistically, no more accurate about the underlying causal structure than fiction. In 1988, economists Werner de Bont and Richard Thaler demonstrated something even more unsettling. Financial analysts systematically overreacted in their earnings forecasts, extrapolating recent trends with excessive confidence. The analysts who had the strongest recent patterns to narrate produced the most exaggerated forecasts and the largest subsequent errors. The narrative of recent momentum made them more confident. The confidence made them less accurate. Walk into any business school library, shelf after shelf of glossy biographies of successful entrepreneurs. Each book promises the same thing: the secret, the formula, the path. Each book is lying to you, not through malice, but through structure. The biography of a successful entrepreneur is, almost by definition, a narrative fallacy in book form. The author begins knowing the subject succeeded wildly, then selects the moments that appear, in retrospect, to form a coherent arc toward that success. The garage workshop becomes a symbol of determination. The college dropout decision becomes a visionary leap. The early failure becomes a crucible of resilience. All of these may be true as individual facts. What is not true is the implication that they were causally necessary for the outcome. Researchers Jerker Denrell and Christina Fang studied this directly. In a 2010 paper, they examined entrepreneurs who shared nearly identical early characteristics with famous successes. The difference in outcomes was largely explained by factors outside their control: timing, luck, competitor behavior, macroeconomic shifts. This connects to survivorship bias. We study the successes because they are visible, while the failures vanish from the record. But the narrative fallacy goes further. Even among the survivors, we construct stories about why they survived, stories that smuggle in causality where there was mostly randomness. Walter Isaacson's 2011 biography of Steve Jobs presents every setback as secret preparation for eventual triumph. Being fired from Apple becomes the crucible that created Next and Pixar. It is a powerful story and unfalsifiable, which is exactly what makes it a narrative fallacy. If Jobs had failed permanently, a different biographer would have written an equally coherent story about how those same traits led to his downfall. The story fits whatever outcome occurs. That is not an explanation. That is a mirror. In the summer of 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a chain of events that ended 17 million lives. In every textbook, the assassination appears as the cause of the First World War. But was it? The honest answer is, not really. The assassination was a trigger in a system already primed for catastrophic release. Interlocking alliances, imperial rivalries, military timelines, domestic pressures, and personal decisions by dozens of leaders under extreme uncertainty. Remove the assassination, and the war very likely still happens. The narrative that places it as the cause is true in the narrow sense that it preceded the war, and deeply false in implying it explains the war. But a web of structural pressures produced a catastrophic systemic failure does not sell textbooks. A single gunshot started the deadliest conflict in history does. Psychologist Baruch Fischoff identified the mechanism in the 1970s. Creeping determinism. The tendency to see past events as more inevitable, more predictable, and more causally connected than they actually were. In experiments, Fischoff showed that even participants told to ignore their knowledge of outcomes could not do so. The knowledge crept into their estimates, making the actual outcome seem far more inevitable than it genuinely was. This effect operates in boardrooms, courtrooms, and hospital wards. The moment an outcome is known, the narrative connecting past decisions to it becomes more compelling and more likely to influence future judgment, even when the causal connection is far weaker than the story implies. A man walks into an emergency room. 47 years old, smoker, chest pain, anxious, slightly sweating. Within 2 minutes, the physician has constructed a narrative. Middle-aged male smoker, high cardiac risk, chest pain. This narrative is efficient, derived from genuine statistical knowledge, and often life-saving. But it carries a hidden cost. Researchers have documented premature closure, the tendency to stop considering alternatives once a satisfying narrative has formed. The smoker gets a cardiac workup, while his actual problem, a pulmonary embolism, an esophageal rupture, a panic attack, goes unexamined because it doesn't fit the initial story. A 2005 review by Mark Graber and colleagues found that cognitive errors, including premature narrative closure, contributed to roughly 74% of serious diagnostic errors. Not equipment failure, not inadequate information, narrative capture. The brain does not experience the difference between "I recognized this pattern correctly" and "I imposed this pattern incorrectly" with any different sensation. Both feel like understanding. Why does the human brain construct stories so compulsively? Neuroscientist Uri Hassan at Princeton showed that when one person tells a story and another listens, their brainwave patterns synchronize, a phenomenon called neural coupling. The brain of someone hearing a story activates many of the same regions as someone experiencing the events firsthand. This evolved because it was useful. Humans who shared knowledge through narrative had enormous survival advantages. The brain learned to trust story-shaped information because it was often the most actionable information available. But this architecture, built for campfires and predators, now operates in a world of stock markets and medical diagnoses. The brain's compulsion to impose causality and close open loops produces systematic distortions that cost us enormously. Daniel Kahneman describes this as System 1 thinking, fast, automatic pattern matching that operates below conscious awareness. System 1 constructs coherent interpretations with astonishing speed and zero uncertainty. It does not flag its own constructions as constructions. It presents them as perceptions. System 2, slow, deliberate reasoning, can question those stories. But System 2 is lazy by design, triggered only when System 1 generates confusion. A compelling narrative, by definition, feels coherent. The story doesn't feel like a story, it feels like reality. And that feeling is the trap. Kahneman and Tversky demonstrated this with the conjunction fallacy. Subjects judged that a woman described as active in feminist causes was more likely to be a feminist bank teller than simply a bank teller. Narrative capture made the story-coherent description feel more probable than the statistically more likely one. Even more startling, when subjects were shown their logical error explicitly, many refused to revise their judgments. Instead, they revised their explanations. They generated new stories to justify their original conclusions. This is post hoc rationalization, not reasoning toward a conclusion, but narrating backward from a conclusion reached on other grounds entirely. The mind experiences this as genuine reasoning, indistinguishable from the real thing. Jonathan Haidt developed this into a theory of moral psychology, arguing that most human moral reasoning is confabulation, after-the-fact stories justifying intuitive judgments. But the mechanism operates far beyond morality. It operates in hiring decisions, investment judgments, medical diagnoses, legal testimony. Wherever a human explains a judgment, the narrative fallacy provides a story that feels like reasoning, but is largely decoration. The narrative fallacy scales beyond the individual mind. It infects institutions and civilizations. In 2002 and 2003, US and UK intelligence agencies produced detailed assessments of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Those assessments were largely wrong. Postmortems revealed narrative capture. Analysts began with a working hypothesis and then selected, weighted, and interpreted intelligence to confirm it. Contradictory evidence was explained as deception. Ambiguous evidence became confirmation. Absence of expected evidence became proof of clever concealment. Every data point was absorbed into the story without disrupting it. The same dynamic preceded the 2008 financial crisis. Agency after agency had absorbed the narrative that modern financial engineering had neutralized systemic risk, interpreting incoming stress signals through that narrative rather than questioning it. The data was there before the crisis. What was missing was not information, but the willingness to construct a story that contradicted the prevailing one. Alan Greenspan told Congress in October 2008, "I found a flaw. I was shocked because I had been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well." He was describing the collapse of a narrative so compelling it had become invisible as a narrative, indistinguishable from reality itself. Until reality arrived. The narrative fallacy is guilty of distorting financial analysis, corrupting biography and history, producing medical errors, enabling intelligence failures, and contributing to systemic financial collapse. But unlike most cognitive biases, it cannot simply be eliminated, and it should not be. Stories are the primary technology through which humans transmit knowledge across time and between minds. Narrative is how children learn, how cultures cohere, how institutions preserve knowledge, how empathy is built. The goal is not to stop telling stories. The goal is to stop being used by stories without knowing it. Philip Tetlock spent 20 years studying expert forecasters. His 2005 book documented that most experts predicted the future barely better than chance. But a subset, foxes, predicted meaningfully better. What distinguished them was not superior intelligence, but a different relationship to narrative. The good forecasters held their stories loosely. They sought contradicting information. They updated frequently in response to data rather than to maintain coherence. They were comfortable saying, "I don't know." They treated explanations as hypotheses rather than truths. The bad forecasters, hedgehogs, had one big story and made everything fit. The more fluently they told it, the worse they performed. Kahneman describes a tool called the pre-mortem. Before committing to a plan, a team imagines it has failed catastrophically 1 year later, then works backward to identify what might have caused the failure. The exercise disrupts narrative capture before it calcifies into policy. In medicine, structured diagnostic tools, differential diagnosis frameworks, checklists, exist to interrupt premature closure. In financial analysis, quant approaches that exclude narrative from model inputs have outperformed narrative-driven analysis in many domains. Back in the newsroom, the journalist has finished his headline. He closes his laptop. By now, he believes his explanation. The narrative fallacy is not a flaw of dishonest minds. It is what the human brain does by default, automatically, confidently. A mechanism so smooth and seamlessly integrated with perception that we rarely notice it. The world is genuinely complex. Markets move for reasons that cannot be captured in a headline. Lives succeed and fail for combinations of choices, circumstances, luck, and timing that resist reduction to a single arc. The stories we tell about all of this are not lies. They are the best tools our brains have for making the incomprehensible navigable. We should use them deliberately, consciously, tentatively, always aware that we are constructing, not discovering. The trap is not the story. The trap is forgetting that it is one. The next time you read a confident explanation of why markets moved, why a company succeeded, why history unfolded the way it did, pause. Ask the journalist's question in reverse. What story am I being sold? Then ask the harder question. What story am I selling myself? That question, held open, uncomfortable, and unresolved, is more valuable than any answer the narrative will ever offer.